We are looking at the 7 churches, and as I said in last week's message, I don't want to do the traditional thing that happens when people treat the 7 churches. They want to treat them as church ages, and I'm not opposed to that. As I said, I previously taught many, many years ago through the churches and did the church ages, but I really want there to be a stronger application. My concern is that making each church represent a church age, and we could easily say that going through these churches, the common preachment is through the church ages means that the last church is the Laodicean church, which essentially would be our period if you go through the church ages, where Christ is knocking at the church door, wanting to get in. I would say that's plausible, but I want you to see the linear picture that I've done here, which, again, may be hard to follow along, but okay. So what I've done here is I've tried to put all of the churches and basically each one, and then broken down linear so that you've got some dimension of Christ, either his appearance or his person, some quality, some attribute being described as you go down the column. I'm going to make it worse now. The commendation, for example, to Ephesus, something that they were doing, their labor, their endurance, that they couldn't bear those who were liars. And as you keep going down, you can line up each of the churches' commendation. We're going to be looking at Smyrna, works, tribulation, poverty. What's interesting is that we looked at last week what we called lost love of Ephesus. Here there is no rebuke to the church at Smyrna, and there is no alternative to the exhortation, because essentially it's one of the few churches, other than Philadelphia, that didn't really have anything overtly wrong with it. Although, let me just pause here for a second and talk about what I entertain doing. I entertain doing the taxonomy of the church, really for the benefit, not for you who have been here for all these years, but the benefit of those people who are just new to this ministry and trying to figure out what is the church for. Because that's the major problem. It is a major problem everywhere I turn, every encounter, every conversation. People do not understand what the church exists for. What is its reason for being? And the taxonomy that has been presented here many, many times really spells out, if you're interested, in what the purpose of the church is. Now, I could have done that today, and maybe I'll do that in the coming weeks, who knows. But the one thing I want to establish is that not one of these churches, I said, apart from Smyrna and Philadelphia that have no rebuke and there's no alternative given to them because there's no rebuke, each church has something wrong with it. And that is very profound. It says that even in those early days, while the church was still in its very young state, there were issues and problems. Now, we've gone so many thousand years away from these churches, and the tragedy is that we somehow think that because the church has many people, a mega church, and it's got a nice building, that it's a good church and it's a successful church. I was talking to a lady who is actually a friend of mine, and she said, I'm looking for a church. And she has a young daughter, and she said, I want to make sure that my daughter can be in the church in one of the programs. And I said, well, tell me what you're looking for. Well, I want to make sure that whatever my kid does is going to be fun and enjoyable. And I thought, wow, that's a novel thought concerning the church. But no one really approaches the church as in, I'm sorry, you may not like what I'm going to say. There are big churches that allow people to have their kids in the church inside while the message is going. Now, if it's hard enough for we who are adults, who have some scars of life we've lived, do you really think that a child may sit and a child may take in like a sponge, but do you really think a child, we're talking about especially young children, will have the capacity to sit through an hour discourse and glean anything? Perhaps just maybe the fact that they were forced to sit through something and if they can sit through it quietly. Now, I said, you might not like what I'm going to say. It's why we don't have kids in the service, and why that's been a policy here for a long, long time. I don't want to have to compete with a crying baby. But in most churches, they'll say it's fine, it's okay. And I guess it's okay if the pastor has nothing to say and it's not that important. Just saying. But part of the problem is when we talk about this, like my lady friend who was asking me about I asked her, what are you looking for? Part of the problem is that most people their starting point is wrong. And so even with these churches, we can glean some idea. The Lord is speaking. The Lord is having John be essentially the secretary, writing to the pastors, the angels of these churches, the messengers of these churches, and begins with, I know your works. Here's the great tragedy. The great tragedy is if you want to believe this, and if you don't, that's your prerogative. But if you want to believe this, the Lord is still saying to the churches today, I know thy works. The churches who refuse to teach people the Word of God, the churches who refuse to teach people, give you the equipping, and you go out and do something with it. Do you really think the first church, the early church, had programs for children? I'm not saying a church shouldn't have something, but do you really think the first church engaged in that? I don't think so. Do you really think the first church engaged in how to build a successful and triumphant church with 7 monetary steps to financial security and freedom for the church? I don't think so. But what they were combating is peppered through the New Testament. And in fact, if a person understands some of the aspects of these 7 churches, the book of Revelation actually begins to be much clearer. The pressure from inside of people who were coming in and infiltrating the church, and the pressure from outside, political, other religious forces. So we've still not left these churches as in we can glean nothing. So as I said, last week we looked at the church at Ephesus. And this church who, by the way, the criminal thing is this church which essentially we encounter Paul in the book of Acts, essentially establishing the church. The leaders of Miletus come to him. Later on we know that John is there at Ephesus. So abandoning the love, and it's very simple. The exhortation is to remember essentially where you fell off the trail, to repent, which I taught is to turn with the mind, not the Latin understanding, but the Greek metanoia, and repeat, go back to your first love, your first works, and do over. And there is an or else. The alternative is removal of the candlestick, removal of the church. The reward that those that overcome will eat of the tree of life. Each one of these churches has the same structure. So putting it in a linear way lets you see that the Lord is always talking in the same way. The commendations, the rebuke, if there is any, the exhortations, if there is any, the alternative, and the reward. And they all have something that is a thread that goes through and through. And I wish that we could take some of this and understand that we're not immune from it. The danger is reading some of these, and you want to associate with the better ones, right? But not the ones who are blatantly being called on the mat for their activities or their lack thereof. So Smyrna, let's talk about Smyrna. And by the way, at least as we look at these churches, if you were to look at a map where John was exiled on Patmos and kind of pretend that you're looking at a horseshoe, and you'll see that these churches kind of line up like this. So the Isle of Patmos is there, and these are all in close proximity. And the irony, for example, of Ephesus, which in their rebuke, they were told to, essentially, in the exhortation, they were told to change their ways or else. And if you've ever traveled to that land, if you've ever seen what Ephesus looks like today, there's not too much left of what was. In fact, both Ephesus, probably, I would say, not so much for Pergamos, but Ephesus and Miletus, that were 2 hub places for people to receive merchandise. So therefore, they're harbors. The harbors today are all silted up. There is little or no activity, although Smyrna remains an active place. It's modern-day Izmir. The population, just to give you an idea, is about 4 million. But of that 4 million, there's only 0.4% of the population that is Christian, just to give you an idea. When we talk about these things, even though these folks seemingly did quite well, it wasn't enough to last. Now let's talk about the name Smyrna for a minute. Smyrna, actually, it's a strange thing that we read. Sometimes we read a word in the King James and it appears somewhere else and it appears differently. So Smyrna is the place we're looking at. If you were trying to trace the background to this, Turkish folks will tell you that its etymology is Anatolian. I'm not buying that just right away, but with a T in front, to T Smyrna. But if you read in your King James, you're going to find that the reference to what is not Smyrna, but Myrrh. Myrrh occurs, for example, in Matthew 2:11. Myrrh and Smyrna are the same word. If you're looking in the Greek lexicon, they'll have two occurrences of Smyrna, but Smyrna, Myrrh, they are all the same word. They come from the same word. So, for example, in Matthew 2:11, the wise men, you have to indulge me on this too, because I cannot pass this by without doing this, but the wise men brought gifts of frankincense, gold, and myrrh. Now, I've told you this before. Go during Christmas time and look at the greeting cards. It's the three wise men, right? Because there had to be three, because there's three gifts, so there just had to be three people bringing three gifts, right? But in fact, we know unequivocally that there had to be infinitely more than three men bearing gifts. There were three gifts, not necessarily three men. This is the type of stuff where it's perplexing that the vast majority of people in Christendom actually believe that there were three men, and they will say, well, these are the names of the men. Let me just tell you something. I love when people who are not experts start to talk. And you can know how little they know about the subject, because these type of gifts, especially the gold, frankincense, not so much maybe the myrrh, but those two gifts were very precious and very costly, and there is no way that these men would have traveled across very hostile territory, just being the three of them with those goods, because they would have been attacked by bandit, Bedouin groups, you name it. They would have been robbed along the way if there was just three of them bearing gifts. So we know for a fact that there was more than three, but the gift, what is interesting is that gold obviously typifies of the three gifts. Gold represents the eternal perspective of God. Frankincense, we'll call it the ascending life that is gifted up to God. But the myrrh represented what is an unusual gift for a child, because myrrh was always used for death and embalming. Fragrant, but used for death specifically. You'll find this word again, myrrh, is in Mark's gospel. Some of the texts read that they gave Jesus vinegar mixed with myrrh. Not all sources read the same way, but again, in Mark 15, you'll find the same word. In John 19, you'll find that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus were bringing the material and all the needful things, including myrrh, to prepare the body before the burial, after they begged the body of Jesus from Pilate, to prepare the body with myrrh. So it's kind of interesting that these are references, and they're all the same word. They all are a derivative from the same word. If you look it up in the Strongs and trace it backwards, you see they all derive from that. So there is somewhat of an irony that this word that is used for preparation of death is used for the church that will be told it will suffer great things. In fact, it will suffer martyrdom. It's somewhat interesting that the name of the church is synonymous with the activities thereof. So that just gives you an idea. Smyrna also has this incredible history, by the way. If one were to trace the history, The Persians had a great influence there. And by the time Alexander the Great took that portion, then it was kind of the design, let's create a grand city. Very similar, if you will, it's going to sound a little bit strange, but very similar to what happened in creating what is in Utah, Salt Lake City, the ideal city, if you will, with an ideal layout. The same concept was applied. So if one were to travel and look at what are the remains, what has been dug up, what we know archaeologically has been found, you'd find a row starting from the base of what used to be the First Place Harbor, all the way up to Mount Pagos, of temple and altar, and temple and altar, and temple and altar. Because these people, the more gods, the merrier. Temple and altar, and temple. And these are great finds. There's a couple of really great finds that were made in 1959. Were probably the latest ones, apart from the ones in 1869 that were made, unearthing some of the most incredible temples along the way. So the idea was that you wouldn't have to go very far from where you came in to the port, all the way up to the top of Mount Pagos. You would always find some reminder of a god or deity along the way, probably to venerate or to help you along your way. I'm not quite sure. But so there's a great historical background to the city. The tragedy is, we know for a fact that Smyrna had a very lively church. Now, if you just read this thing and it's just a book and it's just words on paper, you're never going to get the flavor of how heart-wrenching this is. When you know and you read the history of how profound the church there, its activity. And we know it's historically documented. We're no longer talking about people doubting whether the Bible is real or not. We're talking about eyewitnesses to the first bishop at Smyrna, who was Polycarp, who we know was born sometime between 86 and 70 A.D., and essentially his lifetime overlaps with John, the writer of John's Gospel and of Revelation. And we know factually that they had contact with each other. There are fragments, I believe there's one extant, and fragments of exchanges. And we know unequivocally that Polycarp wrote letters to the church, for example, at Philippi, even though he was bishop at Smyrna. So we know there was a healthy church. We know that there was a church that was flourishing. We know that there was a leader there who was a godly man. And all this is historically documented. What is kind of sad is, imagine your claim to fame is not so much what you taught people, your claim to fame is your martyrdom, because that's Polycarp's claim to fame. When the Pax Romana began to be enforced, and the Dia Roma, which was, Rome had no, prior to a later time, when you get to Constantine, will have Christianity be solidified within the Roman Empire. But prior to that, there was no established religion. And basically, you had a polyglot of people moving through Rome. Pax Romana ensured that you could go anywhere at any time through the Roman Empire, and you would essentially pass with no problems. You would be left alone. If you were a Roman citizen, you were respected, and you were left alone. But when they instituted this, what began to be, and ultimately culminated in the veneration of Caesar, where one had to show their political, it was not so much a religious alliance or allegiance as it was a political one, to say that Caesar is Lord. And if one failed to say Caesar is Lord, you were a traitor, and therefore you were put to death. If you did not say Caesar is Lord and offer your pinch of incense, it was a simple thing. Well, Polycarp was summoned to the proconsul, and they said, say it. And he said he would not say it. He said, 86 years I've served my Lord. He's done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme the king who's saved me to this day? And of course, he was tied to the stake, burned alive. And so that's what he's remembered for. Not so much did he wrote, as I said, a letter to Philippi, but that is not memorialized as much as his death. And it is so ironic that his death as a martyr is what solidified in many ways, as you begin to look at these churches. you begin to see that the mention of martyrdom, the mention of true commitment, and you'll find this in the book of Revelation. You will find that it is the battle ultimately. Revelation is the culmination at the end of days between what is true and what is false. True religion, if you will. I hate to use that because that religion connotes something else, but true worship or true faith versus the commerce, the industry, the mystery religions. So embedded in these are the unfolding of what we will later glean towards the later chapters of Revelation. Failure to make the two connected. You have 7 churches and you've got the rest of Revelation and there's no connection that well. Anyway, so let's get into the letter and let's see what's going on here, because there's a couple of things that I would like to point out. Oh boy, I know you're ready for this. If you have a Bible like mine, page 1560, 1560, or Revelation 2, beginning at verse 8 through 11. And unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. Now it's interesting, as I said, if you look at the descriptions along the way, it's hard to read, but if you follow those descriptions, you have a little bit of what John described in the first chapter, just a little bit, but you also have some comfort. The first and the last, which was dead and alive. Let's stop there. I don't want to go too fast. First and the last. When I was preparing this, something dawned on me about this first and last. My mind rushed immediately. You're going to have to forgive me, but this is the way my mind connects Scripture. My mind rushed to the message out of Deuteronomy about God, the eternal God, at the forefront. God's on the corner before you get there. That's our paraphrase, right? And it really struck me as I was reading this that if we really, even for our church, for us as individuals, we really took just this, He's the first and the last. He was in the beginning. He will be in the end. It means while we go through things, although we may not go through the things these churches went through, but while we go through things, He's on the corner before you get there. He was there before you were there. He'll be there when you get there. So just reading it, first and the last, it's a word of comfort to this church. And then something staggering. He says, dead and now alive. Speaking of, I'm the resurrected one. Now, forgive me again because I'm going to say just some little sidebars. I don't know why you're a Christian. I don't know why you come to church if you don't believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. I don't. I was telling somebody the other day, I said, here's the deal. If all you do is live your life through a set of rules, conditioned by the church, and there's nothing else beyond this is just laid down quietly in a grave or in a crypt, and there's nothing else, what the hell are you doing here? What are you doing here? Why do you need God? I'm sorry. You might say, well, I need God to help me get through the day. Well, you probably find some better helpful methods that could be tangible versus this invisible one if the premise isn't that ultimately at the end of all of this, the thing that is something promised to each one of these about overcoming, the overcoming. There's a promise to each one of these that if they will overcome, there's a promise of eternal life. Now, I know that's, for some people, that's just too mind-boggling. That just can't be. That must be poetic. That must be pictorial. It just can't be, because it just can't be that I get to be here for however long, and then whenever this time is up, I get to be somewhere else. But I'll say it again. If a person cannot understand, and this is the premise of why a person must come to a concrete understanding about the value of studying the resurrection of Jesus Christ, those proofs become important to your entire understanding. If you just come into the church and the church tells you you're great, you're living your best life now, you're going to get rich back there because of that grin you got on your face, and nothing else is told to you about the fact that without this one fact, if He rose from the dead, that's where everything begins. So here He is saying, the resurrected one is speaking. Now, I have not seen God. And anybody who says they've seen God, well, come talk to me later. We might have somebody come pick you up in a jacket. I've not seen God except through His Word, what has been revealed in His Word. But I can tell you, if somebody appeared in front of me, a vision, whatever you want to call it, and said, I was dead and I'm alive, believe me, I mean, granted all the stuff that I read and study out of the book, I'd be paying attention to the fact that that one who was dead and is alive is now talking to me. If he was dead and he is now alive and he's talking to me, it means he's not dead. Right? That's what I said. So, a word of comfort to open up to this church. And then, of course, as each one of these, some of the older manuscripts talk about the I know in this particular passage may or may not be in some of the oldest and extant. I'm not even going there. I don't even feel that it's worthy to touch that at this point, except I know thy works, we've already discussed that, and tribulation and poverty. And take a look at the brackets there, but thou art rich. So let's stop and talk about this for a minute. There's a couple of things here that are interesting. Considering that we're going to be looking later on at tribulation, the Great Tribulation, we're not talking about in this church tribulation, the Great Tribulation. We're talking about a church who is in, the Greek word is thlipsis, in great pressure. In fact, the word thlipsis in the Greek, the best way to describe it would be like taking a heavy rock and crushing somebody with it. It's that crushing pressure. So if you understand, that's what they were going through. I know thy works, tribulation and poverty. And there are two words in the Greek for poverty. One is penia. We get our word for penury in English. That is not the word here. That's, for example, somebody who just works and they scratch and they just get by. Versus the Greek word here, ptokia, which is destitution. Absolute, you have nothing. So it's a very strange contrast to say, I know thy works, I know what you're going through, I know the crushing pressure you're going through, and your destitution, and the bracket here, thou art rich. Obviously, the Lord is not talking about their possessions, their tangible possessions. He knows their faith. He knows what they're about. And under the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews, but are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Now, let's talk about this for a minute. Those that say they are Jews, but are not. And it seems very plain to me that there are people that even in that day, as there was the church, there was also synagogues in these various towns of people that came and infiltrated. And if you read carefully, that say they are Jews and are not, these are people that probably came in to the church under false pretense, under the guise of some religious, they're going to save the people who are in the church from the church, but are of the synagogue of Satan. And some may say, that's very strange, but I want you to make an application to what I call the possibility of it not being so far removed, because we see this all the time. Isn't it amazing how religious groups, and I'm now using the word religious groups, become so emphatically dogmatic about crushing other people? They'll do whatever it takes. We've had people try and sneak in here to, like they're going to find some secret here. There's something going on. They have to expose it. Well, you're pretty stupid. All you got to do is turn on your computer and watch. It's being piped live. So, you know, if there's something that's being hidden, here, I'd sure like to know about it. I love good surprises to surprise me. But it's stuff like that. Those are people with a religious spirit. They come under the guise of being Christians. How many Christians have come to this church under the guise of being Christians, and they've wanted to save Dr. Scott, or they've wanted to save me, or they wanted to take me out? And, you know, I don't share with you too often. I don't tell you. Dr. Scott used to get his share of it. I have my share of, you know, the crazy people, the ones that show up at the door. They're the ones that are coming to get me for whatever the reason is. You know, whether they think that I should marry them or... Come on, security people. We've had those guys come to the door. Yeah, please. Believe me. Wait a minute. I'm not flattered by that, okay? I'm really not flattered. Especially when, you know, if you were going to look at some of the repertoires of those that come to the door. One brother had a rap sheet that was so long, and he was here somehow. I think he had violated his parole, so I'm not impressed. But people will come under all different colors to do whatever it is they think they need to do under some highly religious purpose. So when you read this, I don't want you to go too far. These people that say they are Jews, they profess that they believed one thing, but are not. And of the Lord's words, he says they are of the synagogue of Satan. You're going to read this repeatedly. It says where Satan's seat is, known the depths of Satan. In other words, there is seeds being planted here for our understanding about what we're about to encounter later in the book regarding true and false worship. And this is why when we get to talking about the false prophet and the beast and the mark of the beast, it'll be very easy for people to be duped by the false prophet, because if you're not reading this book and you don't know anything, you see somebody performing great miracles and speaking great things, of course you're going to think it's got to be God, right? It's got to be God. So put that in perspective, and then here comes what I call the word of comfort. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried, and you shall have tribulation 10 days. Now, does that sound like any of the books that you see on bookshelves in bookstores today? Don't be afraid. It's going to get bad. That'd be a bestseller, right? I think I'm just going to make one of those up. I'm going to make a cover. Don't be afraid. The stuff's going to hit the fan, right? People who don't read this book want to hear about how you're going to have the best now. But Jesus says, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. I wish I could just lift this up and make this my message. God's not the author of fear. Now, we're not under the trial that these folks were. So it's almost blasphemous to make a comparison, but I'd say whatever you're going through. I just taught a message a couple of weeks ago on courage. Tharsai, right? Tharsai. Same word to us. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Whatever you're going through, you're going to go through it. What you think is going to kill you, what you think is going to break you, what you think is going to destroy you, you're going to go through it. And guess what? You can do what these people did. You can do what the church has done and taught for centuries now. Pressure, tribulation, troubles, trials never killed anybody. Well, except for Polycarp. But this should make you, if you'll let the circumstance. I remember John Wright Follett wrote that, trouble is a servant. If you'll let it, it will make you into a better man or woman of God. It'll make you into the person, the design, by the way. It's not by massage, but it's by the things that you suffer, just like it says of him. He learned obedience through the things he suffered. If you find me somebody who hasn't done too much suffering and spend 5 or 10 minutes with them, you'll find out that they might be a little bit spoiled. They're the people who always want it their way. They always want to have what they want, how they want it. They don't even understand what humility is. Don't get me started there either. And it says, the devil shall cast some of you into prison that you may be tried, and you shall have tribulation 10 days. Now, 10 is the number of testing, complete testing. We might say not 7 as in completion, but as in intensity. Some commentators have taken this 10 days to be the 10 successive trials that are listed in Fox's Book of Martyrs. I don't care how you want to parse this verse, except that there would be an intense time of tribulation, intense tribulation for a period of time. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Now, I know it's foreign to us because we don't have these things to deal with. But the one thing this church had, if you look back at my chart again, this is why I did this, so that you could be confused. No, the reason why I put this here is because there's no rebuke. There's no rebuke to this church. They're just told, fear none of these things. There's no alternative because there is no rebuke. And they're given a promise also, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I want you to catch something. The very fact that the Lord himself, the one who is at the beginning, he's the end, he's the Alpha, the Omega, he's on the corner before you get there, the resurrected one, is talking. And he doesn't say, hey, you should be rich. And if you juxtapose these people, tribulation and poverty, with the Laodicean church or some of the other churches where it says you're rich, but you're poor. And I want you to make a leap with me, because when I read this book, I don't just read words on paper. I also think many times people get into this, well, if a church has a big building, and if it has a lot of people, and if they've got a lot of things, they must be doing okay. But I'm not necessarily saying don't make this the rule, but if the church has a lot of things and it's got a lot of people and your mindset it must be doing okay, it probably is destitute inside. The churches that prosper the most throughout history, read church history, the churches that have always prospered the most are the persecuted churches. They're the churches under which most people have fled or abandoned. And the reason is very simple. If a pastor is preaching the message, pick up your cross, I die daily. To whom much is given, much is required. Believe me, not every person is able to respond to that. Just like the rich young ruler who came to Jesus and said, Master, what must I do to inherit eternal life? For that particular man, not for the church at large, for that particular man, go sell what you have, give it to the poor. He didn't say give it to me. He said give it to the poor, follow me. And the man went away very sad. Why? He had much goods. He wouldn't do it. For that man, that was the thing he wouldn't do. How many in the church, don't raise your hand because I'm not talking to you, but how many in the church are confronted with those very same things? I die daily. Pick up your cross. To prefer Christ over mother, father, sister, brother, wife, yea, in his own life also. Who can even say, I'm in love with that idea? Because it's a concept of sacrifice. It's a concept of commitment, which at the very beginning may simply be a concept in the mind, but then becomes a reality as one steps out in faith and begins to exercise faith. So it's very clear to me, this church, Christ is speaking to, saying, I know what you're going through. And he doesn't say, hey, I'm the resurrected one. I'll take away all the bad stuff for you. I want you to notice that. I want this small passage here to have some impact in your mind, not just the 7 churches which we're looking at, but I want it to have an impact in your mind that there was never a time where Christ said, come unto me, I'm going to take your problems away. You read that? What chapter and verse is that? If you can find me the chapter and verse, just tell me. It's not there. But rather, he says, I know this, but don't fear the things that are going to happen to you. I've been asked many times over these now, I say 10 plus to be on the safe side, because for me time is a blur, but 11 years, 10 plus, why I just didn't go. When things were coming my way, there was some really harrowing things that happened here. Yes, at this church, with some of it was by ex-parishioners. Why didn't I just go? And I'm going to say the same thing I've always said. God's not the author of fear, and I'm no coward. And I can tolerate a person who does not yet know the power of God and understand what's available to you, but I cannot tolerate someone who comes under the guise of the auspices, the bearer of the bad news, the fiery dart carrier that wants to tell you how bad it's going to get. And not only that, but, as a few of these people used to say, the water's circling the drain, it's not long. She can't do it. I've told you the story before. And some of my staff back then would tell me the things that were being said, and I said, that's right. I can't do it, but I'm not doing it. It's God doing it. And if you understand the difference between the two, then if God decides that he wants to shut this thing down, that's his business. I didn't come here. There's not one thing I can do to save any of you. I can't save. If I died today, my death wouldn't save anybody. It wouldn't do anything. But if people understand what the church exists for and why we're here and what he is doing, not Melissa Scott, we're okay. We understand each other. And as the under-shepherd of this church, No, I don't care what has come my way. I've said, if this is how it's going to be, then bring it on, because I'm not moving, and I'm not going to back away from the thing I've been called to do. So you're going to have to figure out some other way to remove me, which some tried to do. But I'm still here. I want to say I'm still here. Wait, yeah. No, I'm not wearing my glasses, but I could see all those fingers you just put up there. And there were 7 of them. I was going to say, I'm still here, you sons of Belial. Why? Fear none of the things. And I'm not dealing with the things they were dealing with. So it's like lightens the air a little bit, right? I want you to make an application to you, because there's learning about church history, and there's learning about something textual, and then there's making an application. And if every text has the ability to be applied just even remotely to yourself and to your walk and to the things that you must go through, then keep in the back of your mind, God is not the author of fear, is not the author of confusion. He, by the way, does not bring the type of division. Now, he does bring division, as in he came to separate, if you will, with his word. But he doesn't bring the type of division that is occurring, for example, to the letter in the Corinthians in the opening chapter. There's all kinds of schisms going on between those of the house of Chloe, and people are busy stone throwing, and we belong to Paul's church, and we belong to this one's church. We're here. Now, when that spirit comes, and somebody starts saying, I belong to this and I do that, it's the same reason that I have stayed away and cut my ties from association with people who are into this dogmatic denomination. You must put me into a pigeonhole, and I must fit somewhere. I do not want to fit into your box, no pun intended. I do not want to fit into your ideology of what you think I ought to be doing. I'm only concerned with one thing, and I keep repeating this to you until maybe some of you will say, I got it, I understand. My concern is to please him, not to please you. I'm not here to be your Kleenex carrier. I'm here to please him, and pleasing him means acting in faith, preaching his word, giving you the tools so that you can go out and fight your fight of faith. And like Paul say, I have fought, not a good fight, but the good fight. Definitely understanding what it was about and knowing you were equipped to do it. And you crossed the finish line. And in crossing the finish line, there's a promise given. This is the reward, to not be hurt of the second death. But let's look at the first part of that promise that's given, because it says here, be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Now, there are 2 words in the Greek for crown. One of them, the one being used here, is Stephanos, like Stephen, the martyr Stephen, Stephanos. And the other Greek word is diadem. And the word diadem, which is not the word being used here, is used of royalty. You'll find it in the book of Revelation, used of Christ in Revelation 19 wearing many crowns. But you'll also find it of the beast who has the 10 heads, the 10 horns, and these have crowns on them, representing kingdoms and royalty. They are not used for us. We who overcome, in each one of these overcomers, we who overcome are given the Stephanos, the crown of a victor, that person who has crossed the finish line. In the ancient Olympics, they didn't give out the medals, they gave the wreath placed on the head in that very same fashion. In fact, if you comb through the book, you realize that the 24 elders that are around the throne are wearing crowns, and they're wearing Stephanos. They're not wearing crowns of royalty. They are wearing crowns of victors. They have crossed into the realm, and they're before the throne. Paul in 2 Timothy 4:8 talks about, after he says about the good fight of faith, he talks about a crown of righteousness laid up for, not only for him, but for all those who love his appearing. Peter talks about a crown given to the under-shepherds. 1 Peter 5, to the under-shepherds who are faithful in leading and feeding the flock. He says to those they're given a crown, a Stephanos, for their reward. And you can keep building on this. There's something very profound about this, that the Lord himself is saying, you're going to go through something. Be faithful unto death. I don't even think our society can wrap their minds around what that means to be faithful unto death. In a day and age where infidelity is at its highest, divorces, I think, on the downside because less people are getting married. Don't even get me started in statistics right there. But faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. So that's the first part of the promise. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. And what is being said here of the second death? You find that understanding that later on, the second death is referred to as the lake of fire in the latter chapters of the book of Revelation, where Satan and others will be cast into that lake. And he says, you will not be hurt of it. Now, people have tried to make an interpretation to say that you'll pass through that, and therefore you won't be hurt of it. But rather, it should be understood, essentially, you will not suffer that. This will not happen to you. Why? Because that's reserved for those for whom eternal judgment, the believer is not subjected to that. The believer has to stand before the Lord, but is not subjected to that. So it must be understood that way. Now, for a suffering church, a church in tribulation, a church that has all kinds of tumultuous things happening to it, being infiltrated on the inside, the enemies on the outside. In this case, for Smyrna, it was the government, the politics, what went on in that day, plus, of course, the people who tried to infiltrate inwardly. And it's important to understand that, again, you look at this church historically, and there's obviously only a trace, 4 million population in what is today Smyrna or Izmir, 0.4% Christian. If I gave you the breakdown, it's even more staggering because it's a combination of the Greek Orthodox comprises of one of the smaller categories, and even smaller than that is Protestant, if you think about that, little clusters of things. So when you think about this church and how it has not really survived, and poor me here, I've done some terrible lines, because this should, see, I told you, might get confused here. This goes straight across, and trust me, next week it'll look even prettier. But what I want you to take away from this is, yes, I want you to learn historically about each one of these, and it was not my plan to go spend 7 weeks, so I'm going to try and expedite this and maybe cluster a few together so we can get through it faster. But my goal is to show you that in each one of these, what is facilitating, once you get to the 4th chapter, we hear no more about the church. And it's imperative for us to understand that the church can be represented, as I said, through all of these, looking at church ages, but I'd prefer to take from each one of these and glean for us and understand that probably the most important thing, as in Ephesus, they abandon their first love. At Smyrna, there was no rebuke to these people, but what I do want you to see is that they were told they were going to go through some heavy-duty things. Be faithful unto death. The hardest thing to tell people is keep your hand on the plow and don't look back. The hardest thing to get people to do is to be committed. Do you realize that? How many people have come over the years and they are enjoying momentarily somebody actually teaching them the Bible? It's a novel concept until what happens in the parable of the sower happens to them, and they're not savvy enough to know that this is happening to them. The parable of the sower tells about how each one of these, and when the word is not taken root, it says the evil one comes, the birds, the fowls of the air come and pluck up the seed and take it away when troubles come, and the riches of the world, right? So how many times have I had people say, well, I started here and then everything turned to hell in a handbasket because I was following and listening, and it's not because of that. It has not a thing to do with that. It has everything to do with the battle for the person's soul. Now, you can say you don't believe in that, and fine. I'm not going to try and debate it with you. I happen to think it's a reality. No, it's a reality. It's a battle for the soul. And as long as you understand, as long as you have breath, and as long as what the Bible describes as when we were dead in trespasses and sins, as long as you can stay in that state of mind out there in the world, I was there. out there in the world, I didn't think there was anything wrong with me. I told you, basically a good person, do good things, think good thoughts, although, that's subjective. Very subjective. And you cannot understand until you come into the sphere of, you begin to study the Word of God and you realize, ooh, no, I'm very far from that thing which I was professing to be. The reality of that, being able to understand who you are and where you are, and suddenly being, as the Bible talks about, translated from darkness into light, is a radical concept. 25 years ago, if you would have told me, I have to go back further now. I have 20 years here. 25 years ago, if you would have told me that I'd be standing here preaching this word to you, I'd say you're a lunatic. And if you told me 25 years ago that I'd be interested in the Bible or the things of the Bible, I'd say you're nuts. Let alone the battle of the soul, because that's just for nutty people who have nothing else, no moorings in life and nothing else to hold on to. But the reality is that's the reality. And the sad reality is the people who come into the church who don't understand this whole presentation really does bring you to the taxonomy. There is a purpose for the church existing. There is a purpose for you being here. It's not for me to entertain you. You might think I'm funny. Some of you don't like my jokes. I don't care. But it's because you're a captive audience. But, by the way, that works really well when I'm in prison to say you're a captive audience. Where are you going to go? You got an hour and a half to be out of your cell. You don't care what you're listening to. As long as you're out of your cell, you don't care, right? Some of you feel that way when you get away from your husbands or your wives, right? Don't look at each other now. You're gonna give it away. But take a good look here at each one of these and recognize there's a lesson. As we get into the Church of Pergamos, which we'll tackle, God willing, next time, we're going to look at some problems with doctrine, some problems with internal reception of things that are of the world being grafted onto the church and being widely accepted. Every single one of these has a lesson for us, and if we will listen to those lessons and try and understand the focus here, and there is an end goal, that is to overcome. We'll look at that. All of those who overcome. In this particular instance, take a look at all the promises here, because they all culminate in one thing, which brings me back to the very thing I said earlier. To eat of the tree of life, that must presuppose that as it was in the beginning in Genesis, where the tree of life represented something which we now know obviously fell into the dismal blueprint that Adam and Eve left us, but the tree of life, which we read about at the end of the book, which is for the healing of the nations and undoubtedly represents life eternal, eating from the tree of life, life eternal, not to be heard of the second death, again, eternity, to eat of the hidden manna, white stone, new name, power of the nations, and that can only be understood in light of the end chapters of Revelation, clothed in white, not like the preachers who want to be clothed in white. Listen, I'm feeling feisty still, so you have to indulge me. But clothed in white by Him, and your name not blotted out of the book of life. Obviously, again, referring to those like those in the book where it talks about dressed in white, who are gathered around the throne, name confessed before the Father, pillar in the temple, representing that which was in heaven, which will be on the earth again, the type, if you will, coming down to earth, a pillar in the temple, and sit with me in my throne. All of these represent eternal perspective, eternal promises, eternal things that apart from the resurrection of Jesus Christ make no sense. How do you get there without that? How do you get to these things? And what's the purpose for the suffering and the tribulation and the poverty down here and the things we must go? What is the point if it's not that as we overcome and we keep faithing, we obtain the promises? Now, somebody said, what happens if you get there and none of those things are there? Well, then we're going to have a talk, but I can guarantee you something. I'd rather be on the side. If you're going to, I'm talking to the vacillating ones right now. If you're going to be on the side of something, be on the side of taking this word as exactly what it says, The promises given exactly what they are, because they are not just reflected in Revelation, but they're reflected through the whole book of God, telling us about something that we should have had it not been for Adam and Eve, but now we must wait for. There remains a better state for us to be in, and a glorified state and a perfect state, which we were designed to be in, but not anymore because of Adam. So by one man's sin, death entered the world, but by one man's obedience, death has been conquered and has no more dominion over us. That means you'll still die, and I will still die, but that death, which brings people to think it's all over, it's closed down, it's that mortuary picture, here comes the coffin, and, he lived a lovely life, and now we'll send him off with, tears and Kleenex, and that's it, goodbye. But in fact, for the believer, it's hello, not goodbye. Goodbye to this old world, and hello to the place that you labor to be in, where the Bible says there is no more tears, there is no more crying, and there's no more dying. So there's every reason to read this about this church, representing and typified by the name Smyrna or Myrrh, which represents preparation for death, and understanding that that preparation for the believer is a celebration and a reality when it comes to pass, because he is risen. He is risen indeed. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.